A candle was burning in the room and illuminating the space with its flame. Its light cast soft shadows. The nanny asked the baby prince what fairy tale to read to him before bed today. Will it be a fairy tale about a great hero who defeats a huge dragon? And the boy's imagination immediately painted a picture of a huge, terrible dragon, which opened its mouth with numerous fangs at the fearless hero. Or a tale of forbidden love between a knight and a saint. And before the boy's gaze, the picture of a young girl humbly praying for her happiness again appeared. But most of all, he wanted to listen to the story of the Princess of Valhalla, and the boy prepared to listen with joyful anticipation. The old nanny was surprised that the boy again demanded to tell this story. He seemed to really like her a lot. And the old nanny began the story. 100 years ago, there was an ancient magical kingdom of Valhalla. At that time, the use of magic was common. People have used it for the benefit of different needs. But one day, an evil wizard stole an ancient treasure, and with the help of its power, intended to destroy the entire world. The Princess of Valhalla had great magical power and tried to stop him, but all the other magicians died. Since then, the wizard has become a symbol of disaster, which brought with it inevitable death. He became the Reaper of Death. There was only one way to stop him, and out of grief and despair, she used it. She was able to do this by using the forbidden magic destruction, but the fee turned out to be too high. The kingdom of Valhalla was wiped off the face of the earth. Glacia Leonoel, a green-eyed beauty with blonde hair, was the last princess of the kingdom of Valhalla. The boy, impressed by this story, spent a lot of time in his father's library trying to find at least some records about this kingdom and its princess. Years have passed. In a snowy winter forest, a ferret ran across a snow-white carpet of snow, leaving behind traces of tiny paws. He stopped and began to look for something in the snow when suddenly a roar was heard behind him. A large gray wolf stood over him. His eyes sparkled with golden fire. It was Cedric, the leader of the gray wolves. Kindness shone in his golden eyes, and he asked, addressing the ferret, calling her princess, "What is she doing here?" The ferret princess, standing on her hind legs and turning half-turned to the wolf, replied that she would not be long. And in response, she asked the wolf where he was going. Cedric took his cubs out to hunt, and their golden eyes sparkled not far away. And they immediately, in a friendly flock, rushed to the princess, knocking her down and wanting to play with her. But the father wolf was faster. He grabbed the ferret by the withers, saving it from his offspring, and called on the wolf cubs Odin, Midgarl, and Finral to leave the princess alone. He asked where their younger sister was, and having heard her calls for help, he saw that she could not jump over the fallen log and said that we need to help her. The ferret princess jumped over a log that Preya, the youngest of the wolf cubs, could not jump over. The baby was sitting in the snow, tired of endless attempts to jump over the log and tears flowing from her eyes from helplessness and despair. She asked why the princess was here with her father, to which the ferret princess, shaking herself off, said that Cedric saved her from Prain's brothers. The wolf cubs also ran to the log and announced that Preya could not jump high yet, but they could already climb trees. They were so noisy that the ferret princess thought raising children was hard work. And while the children were frolicking near the fallen tree, Cedric told the princess that he actually wanted to talk to her. And she asked him what the conversation would be about. Cedric told her that on the last hunt, the children found a very strange thing. It belongs to people, but people usually don't climb that high into the mountains. He suggested that this thing might belong to someone from Valhalla. He also added that his wife had the item, and if the princess wanted, she could take it. The ferret princess thanked the leader of the gray wolves for informing her and disappeared among the trees. She rushed to the cave where the wolf family lived. A she-wolf was sitting at the entrance to the cave. She greeted the princess. The princess entered the cave and approached the lying wolf. She put her paw on the wolf's head and said hello that she looked very tired. It seemed like she had a hard time dealing with such active children. From the princess's touch, warmth spread across the she-wolf's head, and a bright green light spread. At the same time, the princess said that the health of the she-wolf is more important, because if she gets sick, then who will look after the urchins? The princess, with the help of her magic, cheered up the wolf a little, and her blue eyes no longer showed the same fatigue. She thanked the princess for her help and said that she felt much better. The she-wolf went deep into the cave and began to look for something. When she returned, some little thing shone in her teeth, and handing it to the princess, the she-wolf asked if the princess had come for these. The ferret princess held an ancient hairpin in her paws. This hair clip was used as a decoration, and it was popular at that time in Valhalla. Valhalla, this was her homeland, beautiful city, an ancient magical kingdom, happy people. Her favorite city is Valhalla, in which she grew up and was happy until the day when the city turned to dust. She looked at the hairpin and saw the reflection of a young, beautiful girl. It was her. She used to hate balls. If she had to attend an important event, she always wore simple jewelry. And she remembered how her mother scolded her every time for this. She will probably never be able to decorate her hair with this hairpin again. Leaning against the wolf, she said that she missed what she used to hate. It is very sad. The she-wolf became alarmed and called out to the princess. Her blue eyes were worried. She assumed that there were people nearby and it was dangerous. They left the cave and Cedric stood at the entrance. The she-wolf asked him what was happening, and he said that armed hunters were climbing the mountain. There were several of them. There were dogs with them. They came as they did then for the fox. They killed her for her pelt, and now they will hunt for wolf pelts. This assumption caused horror and fear in the wolf's family. Something had to be done. Save children. Cedric suggested running away. The eyes of the ferret princess lit up with a light green fire, and she said that she would not allow them to take a step. Riders were climbing up the slope of a snow-covered hill overgrown with fir trees. These were hunters, and they warned their king to be careful because the road was rough. This was Soaz von Romaniel, king of Perilode. The young king rode on a horse and told people to also be careful and attentive. The ferret princess asked Cedric where the hunters were, and he said that they must have camped at the foot of the mountain, not far from the rise. She believed that it would be better to take the fox cubs away, and asked Cedric to warn the cubs about this. She also told him to gather all the mountain wolves, and they won't let the hunters drive them out of here like last time. She turned to leave, but Cedric stopped her, asking if he should collect all the wolves, to which she replied that they didn't have time to look for everyone, so let her call those she could find. The ferret princess ran up the mountain and made a terrifying sound. It was both a roar and a roar at the same time, scattered throughout the area from the top of the mountains to the lowlands, and from this sound the birds, frightened, broke loose and scattered around the area. This sound reached the hunters who had gathered at the foot of the mountains. Kilios von Loden, a knight from the king's escort, asked the question in a stuttering voice, "What was that sound?" He was shaking with tension and readied his sword. He was a coward. Stendrav, the head of security, was also concerned. This sound was not like the roar of a bear awakened in the middle of winter. Then what is it? Maybe it was a white goblin? After these words, the knight of Kilios began to shake in panic, and he asked again, "What kind of white goblin?" And King Soaz Romaniel mysteriously said that he had heard this monster have a gorgeous voice, and it seems to be true. To which Kilios said, turning to his king, that this was not a joke and this was really a monster. And he invited the young king to return back and send a shock army here, or better yet, the royal guard. Well, or at least that he would go into the forest with the hunters, because these people are much better adapted to these conditions, and walking through the forest with them will be much more interesting than with knights. The hunters, hearing these words, clenched their fists in anger. But King Soaz stopped the speakers with a smile and said that one way or another, he still planned to explore the forest around and then return to the camp. He rode up to one of the hunters and asked if he had ever seen a white goblin. The hunter answered honestly that he had not seen it himself, but had heard stories from other hunters. The king was interested in listening to the story about this monster, and he asked the hunter to tell him what he looked like. The hunter replied that from what he heard, its body is covered with thick white fur, and it is well camouflaged. He is as fast as the wind, so few people could see him, and when one hunter managed to see him one day, the monster told him to return home and forget everything he saw here. He stares with flickering neon eyes like a demon from purgatory. The body is frozen and the person cannot move from the overwhelming fear. They say it is impossible to convey in words. The ferret princess was nearby. She heard every word the hunter said. She was surprised that people described her that way, like she was a demon from purgatory. King Soaz wanted to say something, but he had to turn around to understand what kind of noise and shouting arose behind him. Kilios was lying in the snow and in a hysterical fit, asked to return home to the castle, saying that it was very scary here. Looking at this, the king asked if there were any dead among those who met this monster. The hunter thought about it, remembering the stories of his comrades, and said that besides the fact that some people were injured while running away and everyone was scared, so that they would never come here again, there were no other injuries. No one was wounded or killed. Kilios continued to be hysterical. Fear completely consumed him, and he lost his human appearance. And when the king turned to him asking what he was doing, he repeated over and over again that he couldn't hear anything. The king ordered him to get up, stop being hysterical, and follow him until it got dark. King Soaz Romaniel showed him the pouch and said that he would give it to Kilios, and he looked with interest at what the king was offering him. This was the best jerky ever, and Soaz ironically said that he loved his subjects very much, and he asked if Kilios wanted him to give it to him. But Kilios's fear was so great that he said that of course he really loved dried meat, but his life was more valuable to him. And looking at him, the hunter thought that he was not sure that this was so, and he suggested setting up a temporary camp here. The king agreed and said that they would stay here for the night, but asked not to tell Sir Kilios about this yet. And they began to set up camp, put up tents where they could shelter from the wind and make a fire to keep warm and cook food. King Soaz, accompanied by several hunters, went to explore the area. He heard movement overhead, looked up and told the others to look. What is it? A large bird circled above the treetops. The king asked what kind of bird this is, and the hunter who stood nearby replied that the bird looked like a sea duck. The king asked him in surprise that there was a sea nearby. The hunter told the king that if you cross the mountain range, you can go to the North Sea. There were several birds, and they flew in a circle exactly over the place where the king and the hunters were. Someone noticed that only hawks fly like that, and it's very strange. The king looked at the birds circling in the heights, and they were reflected in his golden eyes, and noted that this was really strange. The hunter looked at the king and cautiously assumed that they were circling in one place, as if showing someone a place. The king ordered everyone to stand quietly. Some rustling sound came from the side, and at that moment the roar of Kilios was heard. He reported that the thief had stolen the dried beef and fled, and this worried him more than the presence of a monster in the area. And indeed a duck appeared in the air, carrying a bundle of dried meat in its beak, and Kilios was screaming to catch her at all costs. The king breathed a sigh of relief, so the bird stole the food, and noted to himself that birds are very smart, and he said she must be hungry. But Kilios did not care, and he continued to pursue the bird, intending to take his meat from it at any cost. The hunter standing nearby said annoyedly that he had stolen his bow, to which the king replied not to worry, because Kilios did not know how to shoot. Looking at the sky, Soaz noted that the weather was deteriorating. The snow became heavier, and he ordered, turning to the people who had set up camp, to prepare to descend. But before he could give the order, he heard Kilios mooing again. His cowardly behavior had already become quite annoying, and he angrily turned to his knight, demanding an explanation. But when he turned, the words froze on his lips. Kilios backed away while sitting in the snow and looked with open eyes, pointing his finger towards the forest. He muttered something, constantly repeating, "There, there." In the darkness, among the trees, bright neon eyes shone, and Kilios finally said that there was a white goblin. There were more and more glowing eyes. They were golden and blue. The king thought that these were wolves. His eyes widened at the sight he saw. He shouted that there was a pack of wolves ahead, and there were tons of them there. They surrounded their camp, and they were preparing to attack. King Soaz grabbed his sword, preparing to defend himself. From the darkness, a large wolf jumped out at him. His eyes glowed with a yellow light, and he opened his fanged mouth, preparing to strike. He knocked the king to the ground in one leap and pressed his sword to his throat with his paws. He grabbed the sword with his teeth, his gaze burning with anger, but the king deftly pulled out his sword and pierced the wolf with it, leaving him no chance. And throwing the predator away from him, he jumped to his feet. He screamed, asking Kilios if he was okay. His heart was beating wildly in his chest, his eyes were alarmed. To which Kilios, struggling to fight off the attacks of a pack of wolves, replied that of course he was not okay. The king, with a joyful smile that Kilios was fighting back well, noticed that he seemed to be holding up well and continued to fight off the heap of wolves. The king noticed how a wolf with eyes glowing with blue light rushed towards Kilios, and he shouted to him, warning him of the danger. The wolf rushed from behind, and barely having time to notice him, Kilios raised his sword in time. The blow fell directly on Kilios's head, and this time he managed to repel the attack. Soaz asked him how he was, to which Kilios replied that something strange was happening. He was already pretty exhausted from the battle, and he continued his thought that they had hurt these wolves so many times, but they were still alive, and no matter how much you chop them, no matter how much injury you inflict on them, it doesn't matter to them. Their wounds heal miraculously, and they are again ready to attack with even greater anger, as if they were immortal. And indeed, the wolves got up and got up. There were more and more of them. Their eyes burned with rage. They did not rush at Soaz and Kilios, but surrounded them, squeezing the ring more and more tightly. Kilios said that they are surrounded. What to do now? But the king also did not know the answer to this survey. Kilios noticed that it seemed to him that the wolves were hunting for the king. This surprised Soaz. They stood tightly pressed with their backs to each other, ready to repel the attack. Kilios reminded him that 6 months ago, he demanded fur as a tribute. And isn't it because of this that they organized a big hunt for local foxes, exterminating them in exorbitant quantities? And he suggested that perhaps the wolves decided to take revenge. The king shouted in irritation, "What nonsense are wolves and foxes, friends? Does this even make sense?" He looked into the wolves' eyes, burning with the blue light of cold rage, and thought that perhaps this looked like delirium. But they really were targeting him alone. They were everywhere. It seemed impossible to break through. The king thought feverishly, trying to find at least some solution. Suddenly, a horse appeared from behind the trees. Looks like she's still alive. And an idea flashed through his mind. And he turned to Kilios, saying that he would distract the wolves and let him take the people away from here. But Kilios refused to abandon his king, saying that he would stay with him and continue to fight. But there was no time to argue anymore. The king realized that the wolves were only pursuing him and decided to distract them in order to save the others. And while Kilios continued to argue, he whistled for his horse, calling him to help. And the faithful animal rushed at full speed to the call of its owner. Soaz jumped onto his horse and ran at full speed, driving the pack of wolves away from his subjects. Kilian continued to swing his sword, hitting the wolves, who rushed after his majesty, exclaiming in despair that the king could not leave like that, dooming himself to certain death in the midst of a dark, unfamiliar forest. The horse rushed like a released arrow, but the wolves did not lag behind and pursued it on its heels. After a while, Soaz looked back to see if he managed to break away, and not seeing the wolves behind him, he thought that he had led them quite far from the camp. Flying at full speed, he thought that the snow was getting heavier. There was absolutely nothing visible ahead. He squinted, hoping to see something. Suddenly, the horse swayed, losing the ground under its feet. And Soaz realized with horror that they were falling into the abyss. It was the top of a cliff, and King Soaz Romaniel fell off it without seeing this danger in the darkness, and only the wolves remained standing at the top, celebrating their victory. He woke up lying on his stomach in the snow. Soaz moved his hands. He was in pain. He thought it looked like he would become food for the mountain wolves. Nearby lay his horse, broken from a fall, and he regretted his faithful friend who was unlucky enough to meet him. When his vision cleared a little, he saw a shadow in front of him and realized that someone was standing in front of him. He thought that he would probably be killed. He wanted to run, but he couldn't even move. The white ferret approached him cautiously. A fire was burning in the cave, and its flame illuminated and warmed the air of the cave. People are very dangerous. Soaz, through his oblivion, heard someone say that he needed to make a choice. He opened his eyes and was surprised. Was it really a woman's voice? After all, he fell from a cliff in a deep forest. Apparently, this girl saved him, and he decided that he needed to thank her and tried to get up. Sitting up with difficulty, he screamed and grabbed his shoulder. It hurt a lot. At his exclamation, the ferret princess and Cedric turned. They were discussing what to do with him next. The princess looked at Cedric and said that he had woken up and now it was time for them to go, and the wolf agreed with her. It was difficult for Soaz to open his eyes. His whole body ached, but he was firmly convinced that he heard someone's voice. Still, with an effort, he opened his eyes and saw a ferret in front of him. This surprised him incredibly. He thought that maybe it was the ferret's owner who saved him, and he carefully stroked the ferret's head with his finger, thinking that he had just heard someone's voice. But there is no one here. And the ferret princess was indignant that how dare he touch her like that, and the prince immediately jerked and covered his ears with his hands. He scared the ferret with this sudden movement, so she squeaked, indignant that why was he reacting so sharply, he could have hit her. The king was amazed. He did not understand where this sound was coming from. He looked around, but apart from a few household items, he saw nothing else. There was no one here except him and the ferret. And then he heard the ferret, with his head hanging down, say that he was here, thinking that no one would hear her. But at that very second, she realized that no one was speaking except her, which means... And she asked, looking at Soaz, that he could really hear her voice. His surprise knew no bounds. He stared at the ferret in disbelief. He unclenched his ears and, lowering his hands, hesitantly said that he could hear her. Meanwhile, the ferret princess walked around in a circle, wondering how an ordinary person could hear her voice. Maybe he's just an unusual person. Soaz, in turn, could not move away from the discovery that he had met a talking ferret. And suddenly it dawned on him that this was just a dream, and he lay down on the floor again. He closed his eyes and said what the ferret would tell him. The ferret princess walked up to him and looked at his face, thinking that he seemed to think he had gone crazy. When the ferret ran to the side, Soaz opened one eye to see what he was doing. But he quickly returned with a rhizome in his teeth, and he told the king that he was unconscious and had not eaten anything for 3 days. He sat down again and was very surprised by this fact. 3 whole days without consciousness. When the ferret found him, all his bones were broken, and he was lying in a pool of blood. And she added that she was very glad that he survived. This fact struck Soaz even more, and he asked how this could be, since he has almost no pain. And the ferret, standing on her hind legs and looking the king straight in the eyes, said that she had strength. This force destroyed an entire country and turned it into a handful of ashes. And this power healed all his wounds, and she had this power. The ferret princess had a lot to tell him. She didn't know why. It was as if all the sins of that day that she had wanted to forget over these 1,000 years were asking to come out. He looked at her with widened eyes, and she continued by saying that her true essence is her sins. And looking into his eyes, she admitted that she was a magician. He bowed his head. He knew it. For many years he tried to understand what happened to the magical power of the kingdom of Valhalla. And today he found the answer. The magic hasn't disappeared. King Soaz Romaniel jumped to his feet and began asking for her autograph. He remembered that he needed paper, began rushing around in search of it, and the ferret looked dumbfounded and could not understand what was happening to him. Not finding the paper, he began to take off his coat and ask her to sign the shirt. He pulled the lapel forcefully, and a button on his shirt came off, flew to the side and hit the ferret on the head, thereby waking him up from his stupor. And he shouted at the king that he really wanted to die. This cooled the king's ardor a little, and he calmed down, and she asked him if he really believed her so immediately. To which Soaz replied that she saved him, and that means it's true. There are only wizards left in this world. And he told about the old nanny who told him about the princess of Valhalla, and he promised that when he grows up he will definitely be able to find the sorceress. And he said with joy on his face that he had found her, and it looked like it was not too late. The ferret princess looked at him with wide eyes and said that all people are afraid of wizards. Everyone turned away from them, and she also asked why he constantly calls sorcerers wizards. He felt uneasy. Just think about it, he really heard these words. And he asked her, what do you mean she really is a witch? And he explained that in ancient times the proper address was the word sorcerer, but now all sorcerers are called wizards. For her, the events of those days happened as if yesterday. Here she is walking along the city street. Her friends are calling her, rejoicing at meeting. But that means they have already become a distant, distant past. 1,000 years have passed since witchcraft began to disappear. It is impossible to hold back the passing times. Soaz noted the change in the princess's mood and wondered why she became quiet. He didn't know what to do and began to look around, looking at everything around him, and I was surprised to notice that all that was in this cave were ancient relics, ancient vases, teapots, jugs, a mirror that was looked into 1,000 years ago. He picked up an old teapot and thought how valuable they were for science. He rubbed the dust off the teapot and a pattern appeared on it, and this pattern said that Miss Ferret was a witch from Valhalla. He turned to the ferret princess and noted with a joyful smile that when he studied ancient history, the civilization of Valhalla most attracted his attention. The smile left his face, and he said that he did not expect to see something like this here. The ferret looked at him, and his eyes glowed with an emerald sparkle. Fear lay like a gray shadow on the young man's face. He remembered the hunter's words that if you see an emerald shine, run immediately. The white demon has emerald eyes. And the ferret princess said that from the very beginning she had not intended to save him. When he fell into the abyss and horror froze on his face and he extended his hand in the hope of salvation, she stood on the top of the cliff and watched as he flew to his death. After all, they, people, mercilessly invaded the Agobis mountain range, who accepted her, who had nowhere to go. She too was once human, so she knows that it must have been a simple hunt for animals in order to collect enough fur. leaving behind rivers of blood from killed animals. But does he know what the cry of a fox sounds like when it has lost its father or mother or brothers? And she decided to save him who was dying, because he is the king of those greedy people. The ferret spoke to him, but he saw a girl with emerald eyes that accused and made him feel guilty for the killed animals, feel like a murderer. He was a king, so the cat can stop these brutal murders. He fell to his knees. He had nothing to say other than an apology, but that wasn't enough. He admitted his guilt as an immoral monarch. He will take full responsibility and solve this problem. And the ferret girl said that it was good that he understood quickly. And she added that when he comes down from the mountain, so that he will never step on this land again. She begged him to stop this senseless massacre. Her face was covered with a dark haze, and only her eyes glowed with a warning emerald light. And she continued by saying that she did not want to bring harm to his people. But if this happened again, there would be no more forgiveness. And the king, like a true noble monarch, replied that he listened and obeyed. He promised to stop these atrocities. But in response, he dared to ask for an autograph again, and seeing the ferret's bewilderment, said that if it's difficult to give an autograph, then can he shake her paw? The princess doubted, and then he asked not to refuse him with such a pitiful expression on her face that she agreed. And he carefully took the ferret princess's paw with his hand and shook it lightly. Then he was so happy that the dream of his whole life had come true, that Leonore thought that on the outside he looked healthy, but it seemed that he had hit his head hard. He thanked her again and promised that he would never wash that hand, and when I came to my senses I asked what her name was, and she said he could call her Noel, and he responded by saying that she could call him Soaz, and she thought that his name was like that of a forest fairy and asked what it meant. Soaz replied that nowadays it is rare for anyone to be given a name with meaning, and Leonore thought that it means it has no meaning, and the world has become so soulless. And the princess began to reminisce, saying that her mother gave her her name and it means blue light. She remembered how her mother held her in her arms and played with her. The girl thought that to be precise, Leonore is an elegant blue color, but he doesn't need to know that. To this, the king replied that Perilude was still a very traditional type. There are many of its inhabitants whose name has special meaning. The princess was surprised by such a statement, and she asked again if he really said Perilude and he is the king of this particular place. And when he answered in the affirmative, she gently patted his knee with her paw on which he was sitting, and she herself thought that he was a poor guy. It was Perilude, and she remembered how, in the distant past, she met a duck on her way, who told her that someone had founded a kingdom on the ruins of Valhalla. In that very place, because of the magic, the temperature there changed greatly. After death, winter will soon come there again. Their path will be full of difficulties. The princess did not know who those daredevils were, but she felt awkward, and that someone turned out to be Soaz, cheerful young king, and she told him that she would take care of him until he came down from the mountain. A few days later, the ferret got hold of the roots again and brought them back for Soaz, and she told him to eat, to which I heard a dissatisfied voice that he would have to eat the roots again. The ferret princess was upset and said that he really thought it was so easy to find something edible in the middle of deep winter. King Periluda understood everything, but for the last few days this is all he ate. And then the ferret rushed to him with the words that if you don't want to eat, then give it to him. But Soaz was not going to give up her roots. He was hungry, and he didn't say he wouldn't eat. Soaz asked the ferret why she didn't eat anything. It seems he didn't see her eat anything, and the ferret princess stopped and said that she herself didn't know. When she opened her eyes, she was already a ferret. From that moment on, she did not feel hungry and did not die. Her eyes became sad and she added that she was sorry. Soaz wanted to feel sorry for her, because she spent so many years alone. He wanted to pat her on the head and had already raised his hand to her, but Noelle jumped up at him, saying that he was a brat. And having jumped on him, she began to jump all over her body, saying that even seeing how hard she was trying, he couldn't just accept and thank her. And she climbed onto his head and grabbed his hair with her paws and began to pull it, displeasedly saying that he was choosing dishes here. Yes, he seems to be completely mad about fat. Soaz screamed in pain. Noelle calmed down and said that if he continued to behave so brazenly, she would throw him off the cliff again. And he thought that at this rate, he would actually faint from exhaustion. And he remembered his knight Kilios, how he ate beef jerky and said it was really delicious. And he remembered that he had with him a bag of dried meat, which Kilios refused. He rushed to his jacket in the hope of finding the treasured bag. and Noel asked in bewilderment what he was doing. And after a short search, he took out the bag and said with joyful excitement that he had found it. Seeing what Soaz took out of his pocket, Noel's eyes lit up. She quickly jumped off his shoulder and ran into the depths of the cave. She crawled under some papers and began to look for something, saying that it was definitely here somewhere. In the end, she took out exactly the same empty bag and, placing it in front of Soaz, said that the ducks asked him to tell that stupid knight that they ate the beef jerky with pleasure. Soaz, taking the empty bag in his hands with a smile, said that sea duck really a scout? And he added that he didn't think so. He didn't have time to notice how Noel was in his arms and sniffing at the bag he was holding in his hands. The sweet smell coming from the bag reminded her of the smell of apple jam cookies, and my mouth watered from the memory of this sweetness. And she, with reverence in her eyes, began to ask him to quickly give her this yummy. But Soaz said that he could not give it away just like that and offered to make a deal. Noel was confused. What other deal does he want to make? And Soaz, waving the bag in the air, asked that she hadn't eaten cookies for 1,000 years, and he added that he wanted to exchange it for a piece of meat. Noel lay down on his lap with her legs crossed over her chest, and she began to think, wolves must have meat, but will they provide food for humans? Soaz, rocking Noel in his arms while she pondered his proposal, said that he knew that she had been struggling to get food all this time, but it seems to him that he really is ready to faint from exhaustion. Noel thought the cookies didn't have enough nutrients, and she made a decision. In the end, all she had to do was find meat. She picked it up and went to the exit of the cave as she walked, saying that she would go to the wolves and let him wait for her quietly here. But Soaz offered to go together, saying that he wanted to apologize to them for the harm caused. Noel asked him if he was afraid that angry wolves might kill him. To this, Soaz replied that he was coming to apologize, and not to ask him to be happy. These words charmed Princess Leah Noel. These were the words of a worthy man who admitted his mistakes and wanted to correct them. The ferret told him, warning him that if something happens, it is not her fault, and they left the cave. Soaz, having taken the first step out of the cave, closed his eyes and could not look. White snow and the bright sun blinded his eyes, which during the time he was in the cave had become unaccustomed to the bright light. But when his eyes got used to it a little and he looked around, he was simply amazed by the beauty of nature that opened before his eyes. Noel, hearing his surprised exclamation, turned and said that the view of nature was truly magnificent. And Soaz agreed with her, saying that it was true, he had no idea that it was so beautiful here. And he followed her to the wolves for food. It was quiet in the forest. He stopped looking around at the surrounding beauty and thought with regret that he had almost destroyed such a peaceful place. Noel warned him that if he lags behind, she will leave him here and leave, and he hurried after her. They walked along the untouched snow cover, leaving behind traces of his boots and her paws. Making his way through the snowdrifts and small hills, Soaz said that he wanted to know so much about her. And suddenly he was struck by the realization that, just as he had thought, Noel, that man, and he remembered everything he had read about her, about the emerald shine of her eyes, the patterns on ancient dishes from Valhalla, about how she said that she'd once been a great sorceress, although now she looks like a ferret. And I remembered a drawing of a beautiful girl with emerald eyes and sea-green hair. She is the very last princess of Valhalla, Glacia Leonoe, and he called her calling her name. The ferret stopped and looked at him. Soaz had a lot of questions running through her head. How did it happen that she became a ferret? Why did he understand her speech? For what reason can she only use healing magic? And wasn't she lonely for thousands of years? He stood and silently looked at her, and she asked why he called her and was silent. Was he tired of walking? Soaz understood that he could not ask her now what he was thinking. Therefore, he simply said that she constantly considers him some kind of weakling. And he added that his body is much stronger than she thinks, and began to unbutton his shirt so that she could see. Noel became wary and asked him that he could really read her thoughts. And Soaz, shaking his head negatively, said with a smile that she was always talking to herself about how he was too thin. And she went on, saying under her breath that he was so thin that he looked like a tree branch, but noted that he still kept up with her. And Soaz shouted after her that he could hear everything. They jumped off a small rock and she asked if he really wasn't a sorcerer, to which Soaz responded in surprise, how could this be? And continuing on her way, Noel said that she had never heard that there are people who understand animals, and she added that maybe he was influenced by the remnants of magic remaining on these lands. Soaz called her name and froze in place. He looked ahead and his gaze was concentrated. Noelle stopped and also looked up. Cedric, the leader of the Grey Wolves, looked down at them from the top of the hill. At the sight of the man, his eyes lit up with rage, and turning to the princess, he asked how she could bring the man here. His gaze was predatory, his teeth were bared, and it seemed that he was ready at any moment to rush at the one from whom the mortal threat came. He was outraged that they saved this person's life because she asked them to. But what was she going to do showing this man their forest? Noelle took a step forward and asked Cedric to calm down. She swore on her honor that no harm would come to him or his pack, and she added that she was not asking the person to trust him, but asking him to trust her. Cedric doubted. These people brought too much grief to his land, but gritting his teeth he said that he believed the princess. Then she turned to Soaz, asking if he could hear Cedric's voice. What surprised the wolf beyond words, and he asked what she wanted to say, that this man understood her speech. Noelle answered in the affirmative, but seeing Soaz's confused face, she added that it looked like he couldn't understand the wolf's speech, and she said that this is the king of people, and his name is Soaz. The king nodded and said that he was pleased to meet you. He added that they were meeting for the first time, but then corrected that it was the second time. Noelle translated his words to the wolf, and then she introduced him by saying that Cedric is the head of the Grey Wolves, and the Grey Wolf, still looking suspiciously and unkindly at Soaz, nodded his head in response. And Noelle said that it was Cedric who carried the unconscious Soaz into her cave after the fall. Amazed and truly grateful, Soaz bowed before the Grey Wolf in gratitude and thanked him for saving his life. Noelle again translated the king's words to the wolf and added, a little embarrassedly, that it's not very convenient to talk about this in such a situation, but the man has nothing to eat, and she asked if the wolves could share a little meat. To this, Cedric answered her that they have meat, but he does not believe this man, and looking towards the king standing at a distance, he bared his teeth again. How do they know, suddenly, as soon as he descends from the mountain, he will immediately call the hunters here again? And he let out a menacing growl. Soaz flinched at this frightening sound. Noelle said that after living with him for some time, she realized that he was not that kind of person and was not capable of meanness. Soaz was touched by these words. The way she defended him in front of the wolf touched his heart. But she looked at him sternly and said that the incident with the foxes, in which he was involved. And Soaz understood what the wolf was talking to her about, and what caused the threatening growl. And he clenched his fists and decided that he himself should say about it, and not shift everything onto Noelle's shoulders. And he said that he had heard all about that monstrous extermination of foxes, and also with deep repentance for the misfortune he brought, he said that it was he who gave such an order, so he did not dare to say that he did not know about it. And he added that such an act will never be forgiven. He looked into the wolf's eyes and continued to say that now hunting on Mount Agobus will be prohibited, and those who violate the ban will be severely punished. Pain and remorse were visible in the king's eyes. He said that he did not dare ask the animals for forgiveness, but he hoped that they would give him a chance to correct this terrible tragedy so that it would never happen again. And he bowed before the wolf, making it clear with his whole being that he was aware of the depth of his guilt before them. And he froze while the wolf talked to Noelle, and when she came up and touched his leg, telling him to thank Cedric for sharing the meat, only then did he raise his head. He asked excitedly if everything would be okay and if there would be enough food for the wolves. Noelle scolded him that he had just recently been talking about how hungry he was, but now he suddenly felt ashamed, and she demanded that he simply thank the wolf. And Soaz thanked the wolf with all his heart for his kindness. When Cedric brought a piece of meat, he and Noelle bowed in gratitude, took the meat, and walked away. Noelle simultaneously asked her fellow traveler whether he even knew how to cook meat. And Soaz passionately assured her that cooking for the men of Perilude was the basics. But she still said with incredulity that she hoped that he would not spoil the product obtained with such difficulty. The Grey Wolf Cedric stood and looked after them. It was the first time he had seen the princess be so cheerful. Apparently she really missed people. And they continued on their way without ceasing to argue. The king reproached Noelle for not believing in him, and she, in turn, joked that he must inspire confidence in order for her to believe in him. The village of Connaught lies at the foot of the snow-capped mountains. A carriage was rushing along the road, and the groom pulled the bit to stop the horses when they reached the place. A man was making his way through the crowd, pushing people aside. He walked towards Kilios von Loudon, who stopped near the vegetable stand. He wanted to get to this brat as quickly as possible. He called him by name and quickly approached the knight, who looked back at his call. A man who approached Kilios asked how he dared to leave his king and return alone, and still dares to call himself a knight, and he punched Kilios in the face with his fist. From the blow, the knight fell to the ground with a roar, covering his face with his hands. The Duke of Perilude, David von Arrington, towered over him and, shaking his fists menacingly, demanded an answer. It was his uncle. He continued to shout at the top of his lungs that Kilios had any idea how surprised he was to hear the news that His Highness was missing. Kilios, having come to his senses a little, told his uncle that he also had a reputation, and how can he shame his nephew in the middle of the street? Duke David Arrington took the sword from his assistant Devon, who was standing nearby, and the face of his nephew Kilios was reflected in the tide of cold metal. He began to smile ingratiatingly, realizing that inevitable reprisals were coming, and without waiting for the first blow, he started to run. The Duke, waving his sword, rushed after him, shouting wishes of death at his back. The Duke was old, but he gave his nephew a fair beating, and he sat on his knees in front of his uncle, who was pacing back and forth. He rubbed his cheek in pain from the blow he had received, and the Duke, nervously pacing from side to side, lamented that he had raised him for so many years and cared so reverently for His Highness. And how could a person survive on this harsh, snow-covered mountain? Kilios, looking warily at his uncle, asked that he didn't know His Highness. Yes, even if he is left alone in the desert, he will return unharmed. And immediately after these words, he got hit in the head with an apple, and his uncle's anger and rage fell upon him with renewed vigor, and he shouted again that Kilios himself said that monsters live there who do not die from a sword or an arrow. Kilios, offended by his uncle, said that he himself knows that this has already happened several times, and Soaz is a magnet for incidents. And he added, wiping his uncle's tears, that he could trust his instincts. And seeing the perplexed look of Duke David, beaten, with a growing bruise and blood flowing from his nose, Kilios clenched his fist as a sign of the firmness of his conviction, said that he felt that Soaz was definitely alive. And he approached his uncle and, hugging him by the shoulders, tried to console him, saying that now that the weather had improved, the search parties would climb the mountain again. And the Duke agreed with him that his instinct had never let him down. But Kilios, not allowing his uncle to fall into despair again, said that Soaz had probably already caught the deer, fried it, and was eating it, so no need to worry. At this time, Soaz, having eaten the meat cooked on the fire, stretched out near the blazing fire and said that he felt alive again. Noel, running nearby, asked if he had eaten everything, and Soaz thought that it was warm here. His stomach was full and Noel was nearby, and he felt so good that he asked her if he could continue to live here. But the princess was not delighted with his proposal and frowned and refused. Soaz picked her up with his hand and sat her on his stomach. He stretched out near the fire and, stroking the ferret on the back, noticed how cruel it was on her part, but she told him that he was talking nonsense. Noel felt soft and warm lying on Soaz. This could not be felt while lying on the cold ground, and from his warmth she began to feel sleepy. Soaz lay with his eyes closed and measuredly stroked the soft fur of the ferret, addressing her by name and asking if he could ask her a question. Noel, falling asleep, said that she did not know what the question was, but they suggested that he ask it after they slept. But Soaz, saying that he would ask just one question, asked if she knew that emerald eye color is a feature of the royal family of Valhalla. From this question, it seemed to her that she had become a person again, and their shadows were reflected on the wall of the cave. It seemed that his golden eyes looked and saw right through her. They see surprise in bottomless emerald-colored eyes. And he asked the most important question, which had been haunting him all day. Is she Glacialia, Noel? And she did not deny it, saying that he was a cunning person, he quickly realized. The king sat down and shook her paw, surprising the princess. Soaz was genuinely happy to meet her and tell her about it. He was overwhelmed with emotion. And Noel was filled with indignation as soon as she looked at his joyful face. Usually people don't feel this way when looking at her. What in particular infuriated her was his confidence. She slapped him on the hand and jumped to the ground, stood on her hind legs in front of him and asked how he knew about her. King Soaz rubbed his hand and wondered that is it strange that he knows about her. But Leah Noel sadly said that of course it was strange. 1,000 years have passed since she wiped Valhalla off the face of the earth and disappeared. Not a trace of her could remain on this earth. Soaz took her by the paws and spun her around, saying that he saw her portrait. And she asked in surprise that this portrait was found in another country? The king answered in the affirmative, having said that on the outskirts of the north of Paralaud there are traces of Valhalla. He said that if you go upstream from the capital Paraluda along the Rumanju River, you can reach lands on the border of which there is a warm spring. Having ascended the throne, the first thing Soaz did was to go in search of that place. And as he came closer and closer to this place, he became increasingly hotter. He had to take off his clothes, and there he met the first spring flower. These were the ruins of Valhalla's capital, Hydron, the only place where traces of magic remained. From the very first moment when Soaz first heard the tale of this mysterious kingdom, he fell in love with their city, their magic, and the princess whose story ended so tragically. She asked again, not completely believing his words, were there really traces of Valhalla left? And looking into her eyes, he answered in the affirmative. The ruins of the capital Hydron remain. A shadow of excitement fell on Leonol's face. Her eyes lit up with an extraordinary light. And Soaz continued his story, again plunging her into memories, as if after 1,000 years she had visited those places again. Although everything was almost destroyed, the Hydemian library partially survived, and it was as if she saw the ruins of a once majestic building. What was especially striking was the huge amount of books and materials preserved in the basement, Soaz continued to say. He spent more than one day in this basement, and there he discovered her portrait. Soaz also said that thanks to this, it was possible to develop research about Valhalla. He looked at the Ferret princess and stopped mid-sentence. Her gaze turned black, and tears rolled down in hail. He asked in fear what was wrong with her. She was tormented by the question, what do you mean there are traces left? So the death didn't work? She couldn't believe it. Could this mean that with magic, even if it was not successful, she destroyed her country? Leonol was crushed. Is this a fee for using forbidden magic? Soaz sat down next to her, trying to somehow console her, thinking that he had scared her. But she is so deeply immersed in experiences that in a powerless body with which it is impossible to do anything, she is doomed to forever look at her failed sin. She is a curse. It is stained with the blood of innocent people who died. It seemed to her that these people were grabbing her by the hem of her dress. And the realization that she had ruined so many lives in vain made her really want to die. Soaz held the Ferret princess in his arms and could not understand what was happening. He thought that after so many years she would be glad to hear news about her homeland. But why was she so scared? He tried to calm her down, and she looked at Soaz with blackened eyes and heard him calling her, but her thoughts were far away. She thought that if he was alive. The image of the evil magician who started it all appeared before her. If he were alive, the world would not remain so serene. So she didn't completely fail. Her gaze became emerald again. She jumped out of Soaz's arms, assuring him that everything was fine. And this sudden change surprised the king. He asked if she was really okay because her body was shaking. Instead of answering, she asked in what condition were the documents in Hydemian. The king replied that most likely they were processed using magic. Therefore they are very well preserved. The Ferret princess plopped down on the floor and crossed her paws over her chest, saying that this is what it means. The king knelt down next to her and, also crossing his arms over his chest, asked if she wanted to go to Hydemian. She replied that she was curious what documents were left there. Soaz started to speak and fell silent mid-sentence. Noelle asked what was the matter, but he said that if he said it, she would be angry. Then she approached him and, narrowing her eyes menacingly, demanded that he tell him what he had done. And he said that he was only worried about such valuable documents, so he moved everything to the castle, fearing that they would be lost. But there were also damaged books, so he didn't move everything. She asked with bated breath how many books he carried, and he hesitated and said that he had carried 100,000 books. Noelle was dumbfounded by this figure and exclaimed how he was able to move so many books. He can't even use magic. To which Soaz answered her that he called an army of soldiers, and since the ruins are located not far from the castle, it was not difficult for them. Noelle told him he was something, and he shyly replied that she embarrassed him, to which she noted that this was not praise, and she asked what kind of books were there. Soaz said, confused, that most of them seemed to be telling how to draw a magic circle. and Noelle wondered what the likelihood was that they hadn't discovered it. If the basement was mothballed, it may still be there. She didn't know if she could open it with this body unable to use magic, but with what was stored there, she might be able to die. After some thought, she turned to the king and asked if she could ask him for something. A gentle smile played on his lips. He was ready to fulfill any of her requests. He got down on one knee and solemnly told her to ask for whatever she wanted. Noelle took his hand. It meant the world to her. And she asked to be escorted to Hydymion. Kindness shone in his eyes, emitting a golden light. But he reminded her that she needed to know that she was a ferret. This reminder of his ruined her mood, and she became upset. Her gaze faded. She pulled her paw out of his hand and said that maybe it was just better for her to go alone. And Soaz sadly said that she was so sweet that it hurt his heart. And he took her hand again, squeezed it tightly, and said that he would do whatever she wanted. And King Soaz looked at the ferret princess with a look full of love. He was a little surprised that the princess wanted to go with him to Hydymion. After all, he moved all the relics and documents to the castle. Is there really something like a secret room there? Meanwhile, the ferret princess was rummaging around, looking for something in her simple belongings. And when she found the pink bag, she turned to Soaz and said that he was smart, and in the old days she would have taken him as her assistant. And she gave him the bag she found. He took the bag and asked in surprise what it was, to which the princess replied that she was packing her things, and let him help her. Soaz was amused by this statement. He would never have thought that the ferret also needed to pack things, and he asked where should he start. Meanwhile, the princess lay down on her side and began giving instructions for him to put the music box down first. And Soaz rushed around the cave collecting all the relics of Valhalla that he managed to find over all these years. Watching him, Noelle said that she was curious about one thing, and Soaz said that she could ask, even if there were 100 questions. And the ferret, closing her eyes, firmly said that she didn't need as much as she needed. And after a pause, she said that she was going to kill him. And then she asked if he hated her. The king squatted with his back to her, and without turning, admitted that he liked her as much as he could hate her. And holding some rag in his hands, he asked if he should take it with him. This confession made Noelle jump to her feet. She blushed, her eyes widened, and she exclaimed, "What did he say?" Soaz jumped to his feet at her exclamation and asked in fear if she was okay. He looked at Noelle. Her face was hurting, and she said how could she be okay after his words? Did he really hit his head that hard? What kind of person in the world would love a ferret? She stood on her hind legs and looked at him. Then she turned away, and Soaz came up and sat down next to her, and lightly stroking her on the withers, asked if she was an ordinary ferret. And he also added that the one he likes is not the ferret, but Glacia Leonoel. She turned to him and sternly asked how he could say such embarrassing things so calmly. And Soaz calmly asked why he should be embarrassed by the fact that he is pleased by the feeling of love for someone. Whatever her appearance, his feelings are unchanged. In the past, he often looked at her portrait, imagining what kind of person she was, and then he thought she was a little reserved. But it turned out that she is more domineering in character, and he likes it. And he said that she seemed to win him over every time. A blush of embarrassment flooded his face, and he turned away. They sat down next to each other, and she, looking at him, said that it was the first time in her life that she had seen such hair color, and his hair and eye color are different. She asked what was the effect of the magic being gone. After all, her eyes and hair were the same emerald color. Soaz responded with surprise that he didn't know ... It was so natural that he had never thought about it. And I wondered if this was something special in ancient times. Noelle replied that she probably would. She did not remember that in ancient times there were people whose eyes and hair colors were different. She had seen a lot, but this was the first time she had seen hair like this, like molten silver. Soaz, fingering strands of hair, said that different hair and eye colors are completely common, but silver hair is only found in his family. She climbed onto his shoulder and began running her paws through his hair. And she noticed that, as she thought, he was strange. Soaz noticed that it was dangerous to sit on a shoulder like that and asked what her words meant. Was he strange to her? Noelle said that meant he was amazing and was embarrassed, and he looked sideways at her and replied that he didn't think so. She jumped off his shoulder and, in order to change the conversation, said that Ima was waiting for them and hurried him to walk faster. Soaz asked in surprise who Ima was, and Noelle, turning around, also asked in surprise that how come he didn't even know her name. And with a sly smile, she added that he should follow her and understand everything when he sees her. They went outside. The sun was nearing sunset. A crunching sound was heard among the trees, as if someone was running and catching branches. And at some point not far away, a white horse stopped in front of them. Soaz stood amazed, and Noelle said that she was dying next to him and she saved her, and gave me a place to live. Looking steadily at the horse, he heard Noelle say that she had already fully recovered. Soaz remembered how he thought then that she would inevitably die. Calling her Ima, he said that he was very glad that she was okay, and he apologized. Just think, he didn't even know the name of his savior. Noelle stood between Soaz and Ima and was pleased with the emotional reunion. Suddenly, she noticed that Ima was trembling all over. Noelle couldn't understand what was going on. And at that moment, she jerked her hoof sharply and Noelle screamed, afraid that she would catch Soaz. And at that very second, the horse reared up. It seemed as if she would trample Soaz with her hooves. But she just started jumping on the spot and Noelle had to try not to get under her hooves. She jumped to safety, and when Soaz asked what was happening to his horse, replied that doesn't he know? And she reproached him for how inattentive he had been all this time. The horse continued to rejoice that His Highness called her by name, for the first time ever. Noelle let out a scream that made the animal flinch. This was so that she would finally calm down. The horse neighed, apologizing that she had become overexcited and began to go crazy, and Noelle again told her to calm down already. And the horse immediately fell into the snow and bowed its head, lamenting that now it was so ashamed. Her sudden movement caused the snow to fly in all directions and knock Noelle over. Soaz rushed to her, asking if everything was okay, but she stopped him, assuring him that everything was fine and asked him not to approach but to wait there. And she went up to Ima and began to talk to her. Ima asked her to speak more quietly so that Soaz would not hear, and Noelle reassured her that he could not hear anything. Ima looked at Soaz and doubtfully said that suddenly he hears, but pretends that he does not hear. And at that time he stood and wondered what they were talking about. But Noelle said that he was the kind of person who would eavesdrop on others, and the horse sharply replied that he was not like that. She remembered how they first met, how the king came to the stable and chose her, despite the fact that the groom objected to him that it was a female and suggested that he choose another horse. But Soaz replied that it didn't matter. It was enough for a horse to run well. But the groom objected that it was considered unlucky for a female. And the king stopped him, saying that we will assume that the groom understood him, and smiling at the horse, he said, turning to it, that he relied on it. Since then, His Majesty has been her ruler and deity, and she, bowing her head to Noelle, added that he was a very kind and honest person. Noelle agreed that Soaz was like that, and this brought a warm smile to her lips, and she told Ima not to be shy and come to him. And she added that from now on he will call her Ima. And Noel, having climbed onto the horse, called Soaz, saying that everything was in order and now he could come over. Soaz, coming closer, asked excitedly that Ima was still in pain because of that fall from the cliff. But Noel calmed him down, saying that this was not so, and that he should not worry in vain. Soaz came up to the horse and stroked it, calling it Ima and hugging it, pressed it to its muzzle, saying that apparently it was in great pain. And he asked Noelle to tell Ima that he was very sorry for what she had to go through because of him. Noelle noticed to him that animals raised by humans to some extent understand the language of people. Besides, Ima already understood his sincere feelings, so there is no need to worry. And at that moment the horse licked Soaz with its tongue, and Noelle said that she was very glad that she could carry him again. And the princess added mockingly that if you think about it, what a relief that he is so thin. Otherwise Ima's back would be bad. Soaz was hurt by her mockery, and said that he was ready to take off his clothes right now so that she could see how muscular he was, and the horse snorted that he was truly outstanding. But Noelle, saying that there was no need, quickly turned around and walked away, and when asked where she was going, she answered that she was going home. Soaz asked in surprise that that cave wasn't her home. To this Noelle replied that she found that place so that wolves could come. We needed a lot of space. And when she approached the big tree, she said that her real home was very high, and asking them to wait a little, she quickly climbed the tree and disappeared into the hollow. After some time, she looked outside and asked if they could see it. A necklace sparkled around her neck. Soaz couldn't see very well from the ground, but he noticed something sparkling on her neck. So I asked what she hung around her neck. Noelle asked how much he knew about her, and he answered her that there is no person on this earth who knows her as well as he does. She grimaced at such a statement. Such self-confidence was a little annoying, and Soaz continued talking, saying it was just pure passion for learning. And when he came to his senses, he asked why she was asking. Noelle jumped down from the tree and said that she thought she should show it before they came down from the mountains. She approached him and, pointing to her necklace, asked that perhaps he knew what it was. Soaz said, looking at the necklace, that it was not made of gold or iron. It was the first time he'd seen such metal. Noelle said that she also does not know the true nature of this chain. It's a pity, but she discovered it only after the destruction of the country. From Soaz's puzzled look, she realized that he had not yet guessed what it was. And then she asked if he would understand if she said that this was the treasure that the first sorcerer had. Soaz's eyes widened. He swallowed his saliva and, not completely believing his guess, said that it really was, and fell silent. And Noelle confirmed, saying that this is true and is the original source of magic. Ostara, the original source of magic that the first sorcerer brought to this earth. The emerald stone is the soul of the god Ostara. Soaz's eyes widened even more, and he said that this was exactly what the evil wizard wanted to get. Noelle asked what else he knew about this chain, but Soaz replied that he had only read about this treasure, but did not even know what it looked like. He knew about the treasure only what was written in the fairy tale, and the princess said that it's true. A treasure is a treasure. Thanks to it, people could use magic, but he probably also doesn't know that it was because of it that Valhalla was destroyed. Soaz started to say that he knew it, but then he hesitated and wondered if he should say that the fairy tale told about the end of Noelle. He remembered how she was frightened by the fact that only traces remained, and if she found out that this story was told to children at bedtime in the form of a fairy tale, he couldn't tell her about this, and he intuitively covered his mouth with his palm, making it clear that he was not telling her something. Noelle asked why he stopped mid-sentence again, and he joked that he should have known this, and he sadly added that he should be the one who knows her better than anyone in the world, and he asked her to tell everything about the necklace. Noelle began the story by saying that this is, in fact, an ancient legend about the founding of Valhalla. In the past, the northern part was so barren that people could not even get a decent pair of shoes. People could not grow enough food and suffered from hunger. And when more and more people began to die from hunger and cold, the first sorcerer with an emerald necklace descended into the real world. This was their ancestor and the founding queen of the country Glacia Altra. For those people, she was like a god. She saw people to the north trembling and dying, and she decided to share the magic that belonged to her among all people so that they could help themselves. And after Altra drew a huge magic circle on the ground, she took off the necklace and placed it in the center of the circle. Magical power splashed out and spread throughout the world, painting the world emerald and giving all people, without exception, the opportunity to learn magic. And then the first witch began to teach people different things: culture, skills, magic, and much more. She shared all kinds of knowledge, and little by little people began to gather around her. This was the beginning of the kingdom of Valhalla, all thanks to the mighty power of Ostara. But he was too powerful. As a result, because of a person who desired this power, Valhalla was destroyed. Soaz sat opposite Noelle, and when she finished the story, he asked why she ended up with him, and Noelle replied that that was the problem. And she explained that when she woke up, only this chain lay near her head, and she did not know whether the watchmaker's stone was divided by the force of destruction. Soaz was surprised and asked what she meant by the name Watchmaker's Stone, and she said that this is the second name of the stone that was on the chain. And she added that they say the true meaning of this name is reported only to those who inherit the throne, but she is a princess, so she had no right to find out. And now she will never know about him again. In any case, she perked up. If the chain is not destroyed, perhaps the stone also lies somewhere. Soaz's face changed, and he said worriedly that this means that there is a source of magic somewhere now. But Noelle calmed him down by explaining that until the chain and the stone were connected together, it was nothing more than just a beautiful cobblestone. And he breathed a sigh of relief. Noelle, looking at the sunset, said that if something happened within 1,000 years, she would immediately know about everything, because she couldn't help but feel Ostara's energy. She has been taking care of Oster since she was 6 years old. And she threw herself laughing into Soaz's arms, and he hugged her and kissed her on her fluffy forehead and said that she didn't have to force herself to laugh. And she looked at him sadly and said that she must have weakened since she was already accepting consolation from such a baby. And jumping from his arms, she ran away, and he thought that she considered him a child again. And when would she understand that he was a man? And he shouted after her, "Did she pack all her things?" Noelle answered in the affirmative, and said that now all that was left was to say goodbye to the guys and leave. Noelle exclaimed the word "Dalmi" in surprise and rubbed her eyes. She told the surprised Soaz that they were leaving tomorrow, so she ordered him to go to bed early. And turning around in search of someone, she decided that it was probably her imagination and thought, why did she remember her? They came to the cave of wolves, and when Noelle said that she was leaving, there was a howl. The cubs whined so that she would not leave, and Cedric and the she-wolf Anna also looked with sadness in their eyes. But finally Cedric said that the princess had already decided everything. This is not a matter in which they can speak out who is for and who is against. And the she-wolf Anna supported him, saying that the children should say goodbye with dignity. But the children continued to whine and said that she was obliged to remember them, and if it was hard for her that she would definitely return. And Noelle, smiling tenderly, said that how could she forget them? Yes, she will remember them forever. Soaz said it was time for them to go, and she finally waved her paw to the wolf's family and said that if something happens, they should definitely write her a letter. The next day they set off on the road. Noelle sat on the horse and Soaz led her by the reins. Noelle asked him that it had been several days since he had been missing. Why didn't anyone go looking for him? To this Soaz answered her that it might be because he had a servant with him who was not distinguished by loyalty. But she said that he probably had money and could return on his own. Soaz replied that it was the servant who kept the money. And Noelle asked him incredulously that he would even be able to return to his country. But Soaz reassured her that the rest of the vassals were loyal to him, and perhaps right now a messenger has already arrived at the castle. The flapping of wings was heard in the air. A sea duck approached them and screamed as it flew that trouble was coming. She told the princess that she needed to return to the mountain now. And, in response to an alarmed question about what happened, the duck said that armed people were climbing the mountain. And she added that Cedric said that the princess was no longer with them, and they had to decide everything themselves. He gathered the flock and headed in the direction of the armed men. Soaz didn't understand what had happened, and Noelle grabbed her head saying, why did this happen now? She ordered him to quickly get on Emu, and she would explain everything to him on the way. And he jumped onto the horse and hid Noelle behind the collar of his coat, and they rushed back. Noelle said that armed soldiers came to look for him, and the wolves were in danger and death. She also said that they were led by a strong old man, and asked if he knew Soaz, and he suggested that it was probably Erinkin. He behaves overly decisively and demandingly when it comes to Soaz. He will not let anyone down and rest before they find His Highness. If they encounter wolves, this assumption gave Soaz chills, and he said that they definitely need to be stopped. After a while, he saw soldiers ahead and shouted for them to stop, but the distance was too great and they did not hear him. Meanwhile, the Duke met Cedric's flock on his way. Noelle understood that they were too far away and couldn't hear Soaz, and even though they were rushing at full speed, they might not make it in time, and then all the wolves would die. Soaz frantically thought about what to do to stop the soldiers, and a thought struck him. He told Noelle to scream with the voice of a white demon. This will stop the soldiers and buy them some time. And she told him to cover his ears and screamed with the roar of a white demon. The soldiers covered their ears from this roar, and Duke Erinkin asked, turning to his nephew, what kind of noise was that? And Kilios, looking fearfully over his uncle's shoulder, said that it was he, the white demon who attacked them last time, and he suggested retreating before it was too late. But Duke Erinkin roared to the soldiers. Why did they freeze and ordered them to raise their weapons? And he added menacingly that they were really afraid and were going to run away from a monster they had never seen. And as soon as he gave the command to rush into the attack, Soaz's dagger pierced the ground near his feet, cutting through the snow. The Duke peered at it in surprise and said that this was the dagger of His Highness. Kilios smiled joyfully and said that then Soaz himself was somewhere nearby. And suddenly, cutting through the branches of the trees, Soaz flew out onto the clearing at full gallop. And as soon as the horse touched the ground, he immediately shouted for everyone to immediately stop the attack. A white ferret sat on his shoulder and looked towards the wolves. Cedric, seeing the princess, joyfully opened his mouth in greeting. Soaz dismounted his horse and the ferret also jumped to the ground. And surprising everyone, he walked unarmed towards the wolves and the ferret ran in front of him. He approached the wolves and standing in front of them, ordered everyone to lower their weapons and immediately show respect. The Duke asked in bewilderment how they could lower their weapons in front of the beasts that had harmed His Highness. And Soaz categorically snapped that this was the king's order, and he asked that they were going to disobey him. and the soldiers, responding as His Highness commanded, threw their weapons to the ground. And Cedric asked Noel, who was standing nearby, that this was really true and he was really the one who could stop the conflict. And the princess winked at him and said that she had ever made a mistake, and the wolf smiled and replied that the princess is always right. And looking at how Soaz gave orders to her people, she sadly added that now it was really time for her to go. And turning to the wolf, she said that this was their second parting and therefore there was no need for goodbye. And when she left, she wished them to live well. And the wolf looked after her and thought that she was so sure that she would never return here again, and he was sad to say goodbye to such a friend.